Ta-da! Welcome everybody to the Municipal Bill podcast. Today we are having a very special guest for our episode 8, which is Lubabalo Luyaba. Yay! An expert from SALGA, South African Local Government Association, which is the mother body when it comes to representing local government. And they call themselves the body, which is an employer body. So, yeah. Luba, welcome, because we're dealing with a very important topic today. The state of municipal water infrastructure.
I'm excited.
I'm excited, and I'll tell you why I'm excited. Remember a couple of episodes ago, I reported that my family doesn't have water.
Oh, yes.
Yesterday, my mom called. She's like, you're not going to believe what happened. There's water in the tap. I'm like, oh, it's a miracle. But we don't know how long that water is going to be there for.
Yep. And Luba, because I'm also a resident between Ekurhuleni and city of Joburg, so I'm moving in between. Last week I was in city of Joburg. We didn't have water up until today. So it's from last week. Yeah. And not a coincidence that I ended up being a sort of like a person who's a sneak preview of what's going on at Scopa.
Mm-hmm.
The Auditor General delivered a report on the state of the city of Joburg.
Yes.
And water infrastructure was the major concern. So it is a big deal. So yeah, let's talk about it. Firstly, what are the infrastructure reports telling us about the state of municipal water? You did some research not so long ago, looking at the state of water infrastructure throughout the country in various provinces. Can you just give us a little bit of an insight in terms of what did you look at, what indicators did you use, and maybe in summary, what were your findings?
Yeah, so in terms of when we talk about access to water, we mean it's available to you physically within a certain distance at a minimum level. Mm-hmm. When you go and open the tap, you could perhaps, as is the unfortunate instance of your mom, the water must come out, but the water that comes out, it must be available at a certain pressure, but also not only must it be available at a certain pressure, it must be safe for consumption, and there's an entire standard that defines what safe is. Basically, it must have no observable adverse impact on your health for at least a 70-year period. So when we talk about availability, it's the infrastructure, it's the pressure, and it's the quality. And it must also be there 95% of the time. So what we found is there's problems at all levels. There's problems in terms of infrastructure being there. We refer to that as backlogs. Sadly, in our country that has both rural, peri-urban and urban municipalities, we predominantly see backlogs in rural areas where people don't have the infrastructure at all. Mm-hmm. A municipality that matters to you is actually one of the leading ones in terms of not having access in the form of Alfred Nzo district.
Yes.
A lot of people don't have water in 2025.
Yeah.
Then
and actually they presented at the Scopa, the AGs presented about Alfred Nzo and the lack of water, availability of water there. Yeah.
It's really disheartening. So you have that. So when we talk about backlogs, we mean the infrastructure itself is not even there at a minimum level. Mm-hmm. Of course, we've also got backlogs at, I can't omit Nasipo, in urban areas. Mm-hmm. They predominantly exist more in informal areas because the older areas that are built up will have the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Then when we move from the infrastructure existing, we get to, is the water coming out, which speaks to reliability. Reliability is a product of effective operations and maintenance. There we have a problem that's countrywide in terms of reliability. And some of the numbers are showing that our reliability is perpetually decreasing because of underinvestment in the actual infrastructure itself. Then also when we talk about reliability, water services refers to both water and sanitation.
Yeah.
So when we talk about sanitation and reliability, that's where we hear about sewer spillages.
Yeah.
Where the infrastructure is there, So the pipes are there, but we see sewage running in the streets, or the wastewater treatment plant is discharging raw sewage. So what's happening in the Hartebees Dam, etc., etc. So there, the green drop gives us a lot of data in terms of the extent to which we are failing to reliably provide sanitation. So that's green drop, which will tell us about how effectively we are managing our sanitation systems. Blue drop, poor management of infrastructure in blue drop will result in people having to use water tankers, though the infrastructure is actually there. Water tanker mafia is something that's being discussed. We'll park that for today. It's too hard a topic. But where we see challenges in terms of drinking water is something called the blue drop. Blue drop says, is the water that's coming out of my tap safe to consume? And if operation and maintenance is not being effectively done, the water that is coming out of the tap will not be safe to consume. So we've got challenges also at that level. And then we've got another indicator that tells us how effectively the water is being managed is something called the no drop. The no drop, as the name suggests, no drop. South Africa is a water scarce country. We're in the top 30 countries that don't have water. So naturally we would want to not waste water. And the no drop tells us about non-revenue water, which is how much water is not accounted for. There's different reasons for that. It can either be due to real losses or actual losses where the water is a leak and it's running down the street, or people connecting illegally. So, and there's a difference. They talk about real losses and apparent losses. So if there's issues with the municipalities' billing system and how they manage that, it doesn't matter. In the end, it's we sold 10 liters, but we can only account for 5. And our average as a country is sitting somewhere at 45%. So from every 10 liters, as a water scarce country, we can't account for about 6.5 liters, which is a serious problem. So at the level of infrastructure, in terms of access, in terms of reliability, and in terms of quality, that's where we are for both water and sanitation. It's really not good. And some of the data we could consider is information from the department through green, blue, and no drop, but also the number of protests that we have that are related to service delivery. I mean, each of us have personal stories of water services either not being there or not being reliable in communities across the country.
Maybe before, so that you also paint a picture for me, because it seems like there's a lot of actors in this water business. If you can explain to us the water value chain, because I live in Joburg. My mom lives in Durban. My parents are in Durban. There's this thing called Ungeni water. There's the municipality. If you're in a district, you find that there's a district involved. What is the value chain in terms of the water business
And water boards as well.
Yeah, so it's quite a complex thing, but to really simplify it, we say...
Let's start from Department of Water Affairs and sanitation.
Being from Salga, I wanted to do a bottom-up.
Okay, all right. Okay, let's do a bottom-up approach.
No, but I think top-down is actually easier. So we have 2 key pieces of legislation. So we have our constitution, predominantly section 24 and 27, which speaks about the right to access water and the right to have an environment that's not polluted. And then the Department of Water and Sanitation is then legally made the custodian of all of our water resources on behalf of us as citizens. And in doing that, they are given these 2 pieces of legislation to do that, the National Water Act and Water Services Act. And then the department, being a custodian, is responsible for managing our water resources. And what they do there is they do that through what's called catchment management agencies. So what a catchment effectively is water, a droplet. Water comes from the sky, it falls somewhere, and wherever it falls, it ends up in a dam, and after it goes to a dam, it's treated and it ends up at your house. So we've got catchments which are delineated by the geography, and the job of a catchment management agency is to manage not just the water in the dam, but also look at what's happening in the catchment as a whole. We've been slow in doing that process. As a result, not the whole country doesn't have functional catchment management agencies. Then below the catchment management agency, but still under the supervision of the department, we get water boards.
Before you get to water boards, what makes a catchment management agency functional? Because you said we don't have functional.
Oh, by functional, I simply mean establishment of them.
Okay.
So in South Africa, we've got a number of catchments that are dictated or determined by our topography. And not every catchment in South Africa is under a catchment management agency.
Okay.
And what we would want in the end is to have every catchment under a catchment management agency.
Okay.
So that when we talk about water, integrated water resource management, which looks at the entire South African geography or geographic layout, we'd want to be able to account for every piece of land to say it's under this specific catchment.
Got you.
So it's in that degree. But your question is deeper than that. The ones that exist, how well are they functioning? How well are they run? Different set of
No, it's fine. It's fine. You can move to the water boards.
Yeah, so we have water boards, and water boards are responsible for bulk. So you can think of water boards as ESCOM. They are bulk suppliers. So in the country, we've got several. So we'll start, where will we start? We'll start in the Western Cape. We've got a water board there called Overberg Water, but it only supplies 2 of the municipalities there. And in our transition, we've got the Western Cape water system, which is run by the city of Cape Town. A separate story where they've got some dams that they look after themselves. We'll come back to that. Then we move Eastern Cape, we've got Amadola Water. Then we move KZN, we've got Umgeni, Utukela, was previously Umgeni. Then you come to the Free State, we've got what's called now Vaal Central, which was, no, it's not Vaal Central. It used to be called, it is Vaal Central, it used to be called Bloem Water.
Okay.
And Vaal Central takes care of the entire Free State and the Northern Cape. Then you come to our province, Gauteng. We have Rand Water, and Rand Water is getting its water largely from Lesotho. And then you move to Limpopo, we've got Lepelle, Northern Water, and so on and so forth. But in the setup of our system, not every area is covered by a water board.
Okay.
So some municipalities, like the city of Cape Town, have their own dams. Largely, most of our districts that do their own supply also have their own dams. But you can also get a situation where a municipality gets some water from a water board and some water it gets for itself. Because water is very much determined by where is the source. So yeah, we have those. And a problem that is mentioned in the country is that we're very reliant on surface water. What that means is that we're reliant on rain. So the water boards will typically have a dam that they're managing, and then they will treat the water and sell it to the municipality in bulk or sell it to the municipality raw. But some municipalities perform that function for themselves. And then below the water board.
Before you go, so if they were not to rely on the surface water, what other sources of water would they go for?
One of the biggest sources that we don't use predominantly or as much as we should is groundwater.
Okay.
So, Tina, I know you spent a lot of time in the Northern Cape. There aren't many rivers. But the fact that you can't see rivers on the surface doesn't mean there's no water underground.
Yeah.
A critique that's often made that's contributed to our vulnerability from a climate perspective is that as we transitioned, we relied more and more on building dams, thinking that those will solve all of our problems, and we neglected the groundwater systems that were there. What that means is when it doesn't rain, you can't get water. And as a dry country, you would think it's quite silly to rely on rain when you know you're not going to get rain. So one of the things that is underway, but unfortunately not moving as quickly as it should, when we talk about building resilience in the water sector, it's not relying only on surface water from rain, but also relying on groundwater, but also reusing water. Desalination. People at home will think, why don't we desalinate? We've got a massive coastline.
So desalination is getting water from the ocean, treating it so that it's drinkable. Okay.
But the problem with desalination is literally it's removing the salt. It's desalinating, removing the salt. It's very expensive. And the cost sometimes, I mean, some of the figures we have is the technology is improving, but it can be up to 8 times more expensive to do desalination. In countries like Australia, as an example, they've had droughts and they've tried desalination, but the moment it rained, despite that investment, they immediately abandoned desalination and went back. So an inhibitor for now is desalination. I mean, is the price. But with time,
It will improve.
It will improve, and we would become resilient when we are reliant on surface water using the dams that we have. We tap into groundwater where it's feasible. We reuse the water that we can reuse, and then we also tap into desalination. So having 4 sources versus the one which we currently have now.
I'm very skeptical. And I'll tell you why I'm saying skeptical. And I understand that to be the 4 sources that we can get our water from. But if we cannot manage properly this one source, now if you say underground water, you're talking about somebody that needs to still look at the aquifers and make sure that they are not
Managed.
out of the 4, we can't manage one. There is, and I do understand that with desalination, it requires technology. For that one, I'm hopeful, but also there's also issues of tendering because Israel has gone far on that. It's expensive and new technology in terms of what can we use for power but just on this one, learning from this one, I have got no hope. But again, maybe I'm just a pessimist.
No, I think it's fair. I think it's fair, but what I will say...
Or we could do what has been explored, in the UAE deserts, where there's technology that is being used to generate, artificially generate clouds for rain.
So all of those, and no, I mean all of those. I'm optimistic because my argument is, while what you're saying is absolutely true, there are, even in our own context, pockets of excellence where these things are happening. What we've not done or been able to do is to scale them. Incidentally, for Ungeni Water, in my life as a consultant, I had the privilege of working on a direct portable reuse plant in Durban. What that is at the end of the wastewater treatment plant where you treat sewage, at the outlet you immediately treat that water for drinking purpose. And the plant is up and it's producing 2 million liters of water a day. But what we've not overcome is the fear that people have to say, why would I drink sewage? But that fear is not unfounded, because if you look at how well, to your point, we're managing to ensure that clean water gets to people's houses, clean water from a dam. Imagine when it's from a wastewater treatment plant. So the risk is exponentially higher, and the systems that need to be put in place and the redundancies. But we were having another chat, which is unfair on our viewers at home because we're not part of it, on learning from other African countries. Namibia is doing reuse and has been since the 80s and quite effectively. And Namibia doesn't have that much more resources than us. So it's actually possible in an environment of limited resourcing and limited skills, because our neighbors are doing it and reliant on it. So I draw hope from that.
I derailed you. I derailed you. You were talking about the village, and so you explained the water boards. And who's next after that?
Typically, who would be next after that is the municipality. So you must listen to all of the other episodes. They will tell you about the Systems Act, the Structures Act, and all of that. In that complex skew of legislation, there's a thing that says local government has certain powers, and in the Constitution, a specific schedule, I don't want to steal their thunder, but I also don't remember them right now. Provision of water and sanitation services is a municipal function, and then we go to the Structures Act, which says who will do it, how it will be done. And then we go to the Water Services Act, which spells out the conditions under which it must be done. So we as municipalities are then buyers below the water boards. And there's as we know, we've got metropolitans or category A's, we've got category B's, which are local municipalities, B1 to 4, and we've got districts. So in that mixture, we've got, in our 9 provinces, we've got 144 municipalities that are designated as water service authorities. All of the 8 metros have that authority. And then B1s, which are secondary cities, most of them have that. Some B2s have it, some B3s have it, some B4s, which are rural municipalities, have it. And then C2s, which are the districts, have that function. And then there's a nuance that we'll be hearing a lot about in the news. It's called separating the authority from the provider. So a municipality is the authority, but just because you're the authority doesn't mean you need to do it yourself.
With decoupling, like ESCOM.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. No,
I have my own views, but I don't want to
it's
go
on the
there.
agenda. In fact, it's one of the things that I thought we'd talk about later because it's coming from this institutional capabilities and reforms. And, to what extent are we willing to let the private sector come to the table and play a much more definitive and proactive role, but at what cost as well,
Tina, I'm worried. You mentioned that, I'm worried about the privatization of services that should be rendered by government. And I'm going to tell you, right now, if you are an average parent in Johannesburg, schooling for your kids is privatized. I'm talking about middle income. Schooling is privatized. Your healthcare is privatized. Your security is somewhat privatized. Right now, even the fixing of potholes is privatized.
Transport is
Your transport is privatized. Your electricity now, yes, ESCOM is still the major supplier, but they are with the IPPs, it will be privatized. Now, if we bring it to water, it begs a question for me to say, are we not letting, in the floods of privatization of what ordinarily should be government functions? But that's an episode for another day. But that's my one.
And what's worse is that it becomes at odds with the constitutional rights of making water a human right issue, because access to water is promulgated in the Constitution. Hence, even in the early 90s, there was a whole huge movement from civil society when municipalities were actually putting in water meters. You can't afford the water, then your water is switched off. So it really borders around that, but it will be interesting how to see the state is planning to do that, because it's very, very worrisome. Very, very worrisome.
But maybe Lubabalo, you can help us here, because I don't think privatization comes as a possible solution out of thinking, out of no reason. Sometimes you do find that the private sector really does provide these services efficiently, which then begs the question that says, why is it in the water sector itself, with all the failures that we are seeing, what are the fundamental problems that are in the system that has led to my parents not having access to reliable water for over 2 to 3 years now?
Exactly. There's with your water management systems. Yeah.
It's a complex question. And I mean, the spirit of this, right, is to be honest and educational. So without defending municipalities, I think there's a lot of complexity. And interesting that you mentioned ESCOM. So another thing you will be dealing with on another day is the white paper on local government and the assumptions that are made there in terms of how we are going to do what we're going to do. But also to your earlier question, there's something called the municipal self-assessment. So in the municipal self-assessment, municipalities say where they are and which areas specifically they are struggling with in the provision of reliable and sustainable water and sanitation services. And from the perspective of municipal administrators or the officials, there's about top 5 recurring problems, because this is a survey that's done every year. They talk about issues of financial management at the level of the absence of an economic base within the municipality. As you can imagine, that predominantly affects our peri-urban and rural municipalities.
Yes.
And even the urban.
And the over-reliance on grants subsequently. Another problem that they then raise is revenue collection. That the money and the willingness to pay isn't there. Another problem that they raise, which is connected to these two, is expenditure on repairs and maintenance. If you're grant reliant, you're not collecting revenue, it's no surprise that you will not be able to do operations and maintenance. It stands to reason because the money isn't there. But again, as I said, that's the perspective of municipalities. We may have different views. Then they also raise wastewater infrastructure quality and environmental compliance. Again, you could argue it's linked to these as well. And then they raise water conservation and demand management, which is water use efficiency. Again, you could argue it's linked to these in terms of issues of leaks and money not or water not being accounted for. So from the perspective of municipalities, obviously there's different municipalities and different ones will have different challenges, but on aggregate those are the recurring issues that are coming out in terms of the challenges that they face. Then, without getting into it, a challenge that we have is that the design of the system assumes municipalities will be able to raise 90% of their recurrent expenditure. In that 90%, let's talk about 9 rands. So if a municipality needs 10 rands to run, the assumption says 9 rands they'll be able to raise. But a precondition to raise that 9 rands is you need economic development such that people are employed. And when people are employed, people will be able to pay for services. And then that 10% that you can't raise coincidentally matches the portion that local government has from the national share. But what has happened? Employment has not occurred or is not at the levels that we'd like it. And municipalities also don't have all of the trading services in one municipality because the design says rough and average 4 rands out of 10 rands must come from electricity. 10%, let's say 1 rand 10 cents must come from water, and then the other 1 rand must come from sanitation and refuse removal. So and then the other from property rates. So you then have to ask, when your municipality doesn't have all of those functions, how is it supposed to be financially viable? The argument would be, no, you have less functions, therefore you need less money. I don't know. But taking all of that confluence of issues together, your question then stands, is the private sector the answer? And China wants us to be learning citizens. Our faves in Europe, there's a pattern that's happening there, and it's called the remunicipalization of public services. Because they've learned that privatization actually isn't, it's not a silver bullet. Especially on goods that are public.
Absolutely.
Where we must be concerned not only with making revenue, but equity and access through affordability. And the finding there is that this is better done in the state where you have this cross-subsidization between services, which we're not necessarily always in short. But we don't want to demonize the private sector. It may be possible for them to assist, perhaps not completely in everything, but certain things. And we've seen this, right? There's things called performance-based contracts. So if I, as a Kuruleni actually has one on non-revenue water reduction, and the simple deal there is we as Ekuruleni have a license to buy 1 million liters of water. If you as the private sector player can help us to reduce how much we buy without depriving for community, whatever savings we can get, we will share. Maybe I get 30% and you as a municipality get 70%. So there it's a win-win.
Revenue sharing.
It's solving a problem that the municipality has. It's not additional expenditure. Of course, you can argue it's inefficiency that should not be there in the first place. But again, you could look at a contract like that and say, in a functional system, you use that and you have, it's not permanent, and whatever efficiencies the private sector helps you to unlock, you embed them through knowledge and skills transfer, and then you improve as a municipality.
There's this notion that says our services that are provided by municipalities are already the cost of they're not cost reflective. They are heavily subsidized, and if they were to reflect the cost, we would actually be paying much higher than we are currently paying. Is that even true in the case of water?
That is a very complex question. So basically,
I'm sorry.
No, I mean, it doesn't not have an answer. Basically, what it says is, how much does it cost you to provide a liter of water, and how much are you charging for it? But in the South African context, we have to add another layer, because we have indigent policies, right? If you are an indigent household, you get, we call it free basic services. I prefer subsidized. So for building stuff, there's conditional infrastructure grants. So metros, urban settlements development grant, we've got the integrated, a portion of it rather, integrated urban development grant, and then the municipal infrastructure grant. That takes care of backlog eradication, if you will, or building new stuff. Then we have something called the local government equitable share, which is meant now to assist you to run things, but it's supposed to subsidize indigent or poor households. And in the equitable share, there's something for basic services. The question that municipalities have raised, and SALG has done some work on this, was that is that subsidy cost reflective? Meaning, is the subsidy that municipalities get from municipalities matching how much it costs municipalities to provide water,
that service,
and very importantly, to poor households?
Absolutely.
But
What
where
was
the
the
system,
answer?
the answer is no,
Okay.
because Treasury simply uses an aggregate. Because when we're looking at how much it costs me to provide a service, think of your car. You have to look at the whole thing.
Sure.
And it's informed primarily by the condition of the infrastructure. So what condition is my infrastructure in? And on that basis, how much do I need to effectively operate and repair and maintain that infrastructure? And from the Treasury side, because that data for most municipalities doesn't exist, you have to ask, where does Treasury get that data themselves? The second thing that Treasury does, we're not bashing Treasury. To simplify things, they use an aggregated number for everyone. But the issue is, as you can imagine, the cost of providing water in an urban area might be lower due to economies of scale and densification compared to a rural area.
In
Where
the
you live on
northern
that
Cape.
hill, she lives on that hill, or in the Northern Cape. Also in the Northern Cape,
communities,
the water quality sometimes, right, is not readily drinkable. So we have to do some version of desalination, which comes to a ridiculous cost. So there's also an argument that says the subsidy that municipalities receive from the fiscus, let's not make it about Treasury, is not in and of itself cost reflective in the first place.
Sure.
And you can imagine when you've got a system where majority of the people are indigent, and for the majority of the people, you're not getting a cost reflective subsidy, you have no business. This is one of the reasons why people say the private sector thing is just a fantasy, because when they run the numbers, they'll see it's not feasible. So there's challenges there as a side thing. And when people talk about cost reflectivity, I think we must apply the argument across to say, is one a precondition, incidentally, in the Systems Act, which is a principle for public finance. It says services must be provided in a manner that is efficient, prudent, So we have to ask, are municipalities providing this service efficiently? If we have non-revenue water sitting at 45%, the answer is an immediate no. Without getting to whose fault is it. So we must be careful, and this is my critique again of the current discourse. We talk about cost reflective tariffs, assuming there's efficiency. But the efficiency is clearly not there. A fail we can debate is, without getting into it, that we all understand. So we know Kusile and Medupi were over budget. That's inefficiency. So in the tariff that ESCOM charges, is that inefficiency being subsidized by?
Of course, it gets
But the law says no.
Consumer.
But it's not passed down. Or we choose not to believe that. So a fundamental discussion I think we need to be having is those nice words that are there in the Systems Act and the Water Services Act. What do they mean? How are they measured? Where are we on them? And then we can talk about fancy things like cost reflective tariffs. Because if we talk about cost reflectivity, where we are passing down inefficiency to the end user, that's not equitable in any shape or form.
No, I'm answered here. And another perspective that I'd like to bring in is the losses. It's the losses, the leakages, both, practically and also hypothetically speaking, financially. And it talks to infrastructure. For example, city of Joburg is a growing city. The demand for services has grown exponentially. But the underground infrastructure that we do not see, which includes water, is the biggest question for me in terms of, has a city such as Johannesburg been able to develop new infrastructure, yet along maintaining old infrastructure, meeting the demands? And this is where the leakages come in. The so-called illegal connections, they come in as well. So, how do we get past that issue? Because one of the most incredible things that I've actually looked at when I was looking at these AG reports is that there's an 8% that municipalities are supposed to spend through their capital budgets and infrastructure. Cities are not spending, they're not allocating that 8%, they're only allocating average 2%. So
at best.
So
let's talk about that. What that says is, again, I know not everyone has a car, but imagine you had a car. what that 8% says is, on average, you should be spending 8% of the current replacement cost of that car on repairs and maintenance in order to keep it functioning as well as it ought to. And that's from National Treasury Circular 61 of 2014. But there's a big debate about that, right? On the scientific soundness of that number. Hence, it's actually not a law. It's a guideline. Because if you talk about a dam which costs billions of rands, you will never have 8%, and you don't need to spend 8%. But when you talk about a little pump that has a 2-year lifespan and needs to be changed consistently, you may find that you need to spend 20% of its value. So what's actually needed at a regulatory level is to further break that down to say, for this type of infrastructure, what you must spend is this. And that's where I would say, I mean, I work for SAGA, so I accept maybe I'm being defensive. Municipalities don't regulate themselves. So there's a gap in how, in regulation. Back to my earlier point, what are we measure? We need to move in a direction where we measure the right things and measure things correctly. Instead of being fixated on did the municipality spend the grant or not, and having consequences for that, we need to come to these things that say you must spend this much, because currently it's discretionary, and I don't think that's helping us.
If you say they don't regulate themselves, then what is the role of the Department of Water and Sanitation like? And I was going to ask, because always when you talk about water, in my mind it draws parallel to electricity, that you've got NERSA in the case of the electricity, which is the regulator. Is there something similar for water? And I'll get back to a water regulator in terms of the tariffs and stuff like that, but just in terms of the general basic indicators that municipalities should drive towards.
That's an excellent point, because in the electricity space, incidentally, there's a piece there that says an efficient distributor can charge a cost-reflective tariff. Because in the electricity space, there's an understanding that a precondition for cost reflectiveness in tariff is efficiency, because you can't pass down your inefficiency. In the water space, we don't have that. I know you said you'll get to the economic regulator issue later, but you also have to ask, to what extent does NERSA apply that in the instance of ESCOM? Because there's a trick, right? How do you measure the efficiency of a monopoly? Because the monopoly will tell you, oh, you don't want to give me the money, sit in the dark. And this is where the emergence of the private sector becomes sexy, if you will, because you have competition, and competition introduces efficiency in theory. But with infrastructure, it's not quite the same thing, because these things are there for 100 years. It's not like Uber, where if I'm not happy with your service, I'm going to call you.
Of course.
We're not in that space. But here's the bigger problem that we have. We maybe disagree on the 8%. But what we all agree on is we've not invested enough in the maintenance and repair of infrastructure. To your point, as evidenced by the losses and a myriad of things. So my question then becomes, I am municipality X, I have not invested enough in repairs and maintenance. My argument to both of you is, in my non-investment in repairs and maintenance, you have benefited from a tariff that is lower than it should be. So you have saved, and now tomorrow I'm going to increase my tariff by 40%. If you don't give me 40%, you're just not going to have water. Is that equitable? Is that fair? And as you think about that, ask yourself, if you say no, the infrastructure is nice, it gives you feedback, it just stops working. So we're at a point now where what is needed is far greater than that 1%, because every year it's like a car again. If you don't repair this little part, it affects another part, it compounds. So we're way past, in most municipalities, the 8% requirement. Some municipalities need to spend 30%. And we know for a fact that that money is not there. Again, the sexiness of the private sector enters. Because they can lend you the money that you don't have. But you will say to me, if you're being inefficient,
you going to borrow money is a recipe for disaster, because more money is not the answer. And I would say, if I don't have the answer, if I don't get more money, the infrastructure is going to continually collapse.
Yes.
Because how much
I need to spend and what I'm spending is resulting in the infrastructure decaying much faster. So we've entered that catch-22.
Yes.
So if that's, it seems like money is the big part of this. How much of it, let's say they were to get the money, let's say for some weird reason, Elon Musk decides that he will invest in South Africa like how he wanted to invest in Australian electricity.
Please stop
I'm
mentioning
playing the devil's advocate here.
this podcast.
Let's say,
I'm just going to drink my water.
drink your water and listen to me. So let's say that money is no longer a problem, because we also talk about the technical capacity in the value chain, not only in the municipality. How much do we have the technical capacity to deal with the issues of water as you have outlined them?
That, I have to honestly say, maybe.
Maybe.
Why I say maybe is the concoction we allowed to fester is quite complex. Of course, I mean, I'm an engineer by training, and engineers will crucify me and say, no, we've got more than enough capacity. We can do this.
And people are graduating every day.
Exactly.
But
And I have to mention that I did mention the issue of cutting municipality. Yes.
things are tough there.
Yes, things are very tough.
But
When they had to take the municipality to court because they were not doing what they were supposed to do in the water treatment plant.
so,
Do we have the capacity or not?
Oh, it varies.
there's a meme. He's crying. He's like,
To take your diplomatic term, there's a variation.
I think it varies. So when we talk about capacity, and again, you guys know more about this than me, people want to individualize it. But I like the term you used, institutional capacity.
Yes.
What is the municipality as an institution?
Uh-huh.
Because it's not just the engineers that are going to make the thing work. You need a capable HR.
Yes.
You need a capable finance department, and so when I'm hesitant,
Political oversight and monitoring.
because as you're going to tell your viewers at another point, the definition of a municipality is council, administration, and community. We're in this thing together.
Yeah.
So for me, when I think about these things, when someone says, do we have the capacity at a municipal level, I'm thinking of all three.
Yeah.
And I honestly can't look you in the eye and say yes.
Yeah.
I think maybe. In some instances, yes. In other instances, no.
Yeah.
But also at an administrative level, a serious problem that we're seeing is local government is not the employer of choice. It's good and well for the skills to exist in the country. But if municipalities can't, one, attract those skills, afford those skills, or retain those skills, then they're as good as not there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I read in one research report that I got hold of in what do you call this academic platform where we get all the research, both published and unpublished, was one critical aspect raising the issue of local government not being the favorable employer. And it was looking at engineers. Do they find local government an attractive space to go into professionally? And the outcomes of that research were very, very worrisome, because engineers were absolutely saying no. And one particular reason that was raised is that it's too politically dense, in that sense that you've got political office bearers. So obviously, your executive decision makers who do not understand the complexity of engineering, being a water engineer, what you're supposed to do, how you need to carry out your work, etc. I mean, I had a conversation with one guy who's an engineer who said, you know what, we had a flooding situation. He was in the roads department. We have a flooding situation. It's raining. The floods have actually affected one of our transformers in the municipality in that ward. They had no electricity. So, Stockcheese MMC, we'll try to resolve this issue, but unfortunately we cannot bring a grader, cannot discharge or deploy a grader because the water table is still increasing. It won't make sense. They said to me, you know what my MMC said? Suck the water out of the water table.
Oh my. Oh my. Stop talking. Yeah, I had this conversation, Tina. We're talking about capable people in a system that doesn't allow them to do what they're supposed to do. And we were distinguishing between the capacity in an institution and the capability, because those are two things. And it does sound like it's a combination of capacity and capabilities. And I would just generalize and say maybe in your smaller municipalities, and particularly in the rural municipalities, people don't want to move to rural municipalities. There you might have a capacity issue, but in bigger municipalities it's more about the capability, because yes, municipalities pay well, that I know for a fact, and they will attract all sorts of engineers, but are those engineers or those specialists in the different trading services, is the environment enabling them to do the right thing?
Look, also,
And it goes back to that political environment, because local government is very political.
I'm gonna sidestep that one explicitly, but I think again, and I like the point you're making. So for me, it's we want political oversight, but not political interference.
Yes.
And I think the nuance is sometimes missed. But I think at the same time, and this is a problem and a challenge to the engineering profession, I'm sure you'll have heard jokes like, if you're not good with people, be an engineer.
Yeah.
I think that's absolute nonsense, especially for engineers who are going to be working in a space that you're working for the public.
Absolutely.
So I think I'm also wary of tyranny by bureaucrats or tyranny by engineers.
Yes.
Because we assume just because
I've got the technical expertise.
I know what's right and I must decide for everyone. So I think the professions have a long way to go in really internalizing democracy. And I think it starts with being able to meaningfully engage both with political audiences, but also community members that are non-technical, and being able to persuade them.
Yeah.
A lot of people in the, let's call it quantitative sciences, because that glass is 65% full, I think everything is like that. But it doesn't work like that. There's a persuasion, there's an educating, there's an empowering that people have to do. But a lot of professionals don't see that as part and parcel of their job.
Yes.
And I would argue that a professional in a developing country context has to take on a bigger burden. That's more than just telling you to 5 decimal places how full this glass is.
Yeah.
And a lot of my peers, I have to unfortunately be critical and say they don't see that as their job.
Yeah.
And they want to run to the private sector where you don't have to interface or interact with anyone.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that's the biggest problem,
Yeah.
but I think it's also a challenge that we often don't address, and it's so much easier to throw stones. Oh, the politicians are corrupt. Oh, these community people don't understand.
Yes.
We're not saving PDFs here. We're saving lives.
You know,
Like basically,
And when
if
you
you
look
work
at it
in a
like that.
municipality, you're not just saving PDFs, you're saving lives. Because if there's no clean water, we've got instances where people have died of cholera and those things. My one last question on this discussion, and I know that with all the challenges that we have, whether be they in terms of capability, in terms of infrastructure planning, in terms of funding, and at the end of the day, I would speak for myself. And I think I'm one of the very fortunate people. 90 days out of 100 days, I have got water running out of my tap. Others might have less than that. Why is it important that people, even when it says like the system is not operating optimally, why is it important for them to pay for water?
and you
And
know,
it's a very important question, because I'm starting to question my payment for water, because I just lost 8 days of not getting water running in my tap. I've had to go and refill drinking water at Pick and Pay, where I have to pay for that water. Understand? I have to go and drive to the nearest water tanker, which is about 900 meters away. I can't walk there. because I need to get some water for bathing at home. And obviously there's limitations. To upscale the amount of water that I have to go to my house in Ekurhuleni, because I'm living in both jurisdictions, to go and get water for Ekurhuleni, to bring back to the city of Joburg. Is that compensate me for my petrol, the inconvenience, the extra amount of money that I paid to Pick and Pay? So it's a very valid question.
No, these things are real.
And others are actually saying, hey, we want to go and drill boreholes because we are tired of this. And they asked in my group, is it legal to drill a borehole? And I said, yes, it is legal, but you've got to give the city a notice because it's Section 41. Yeah, and you have to get it registered. So it means that I can go independent. I said, no, you still have to pay because there's an infrastructure connection that is already existing and there's sanitation.
And it must be maintained.
They were like, oh, yes. Geez, how are we going to go independent?
Yeah, but everybody wants to be off-grid, to be quite honest. And I bet the question is, why should we not go off-grid? We're already with electricity, we've done that. If with water we can do that, why is it important that even when why is it important that I pay for my water with all the inefficiencies
and not get a discount? After not having water for 8 days.
I must say, and there's an interesting report that the Water Research Commission did, and they find a correlation between willingness to pay and quality of service.
Yes.
And the very obvious thing that comes about there is, if we want to improve payment, give people quality services, a lot of South Africans, middle class, are really tired of paying and not getting what they pay for. But I'd say the difference with water, though, is it's typically prepaid or postpaid, but you pay per unit. So you only pay for that which you've used. That doesn't excuse the fact that you have gone so many days without water, but your bill at the end of the day would only reflect that which you have utilized. But you could come with a counter that says some municipalities have a flat fee that charges you and assumes you have access.
In a day, I can tell you.
So that's why I quickly sidestepped there. So
One of December was not around.
still there was a charge.
There was a charge.
And your point is valid then, to say, if you're not investing that money to maintain the infrastructure, why should I be paying? And as a consumer, you have certain protections. So what I'll say is that ought not to be happening. And why you should pay is that notionally, you paying enables the municipality to not only provide the water to you, but also to subsidize other users in the system that are unemployed and unable to afford the service. Remember, we spoke about the subsidy that's not cost reflective. So there's a topping up that you do. I know you feel like you're already taxed too much already, but it is what it is. So if and again, this is the risk even on the electricity side. When you go off grid, it's great for you, but that's a loss of revenue to the municipality, and it will have other ripple effects on everything else.
Of course, my mom,
but it's not your fault.
Indigent as well.
Exactly.
It impacts on her as well. It does seem, Tina, that as much as there are many problems in the water sector, we shouldn't lose faith in the institutions that are meant to be providing water, from the National Department of Water and Sanitation to the water bodies, the municipalities, and the responsibility of myself as a consumer, which is to pay.
That's why our podcast is
municipal bill.
Pay municipal bills.
Having said that, it amplifies, I think what you said, it amplifies that there needs to be this trust relationship between the provider and the consumer. And you build trust by making sure that it's reliable and you know that you're going to have it and you'll be charged what you've
accuracy in billing.
And we're still very far from that. So my takeaway from this is that things might not be perfect, but at least I understand the system, and I live in hope that if we do decide one day to tap in those 3 other sources of water, we would have perfected this one, which is surface water.
Well, we can, as someone used to say, we can chew gum and walk. More than one thing can be done at a time.
Of course.
But what I would add from pay those bills, it's use the water sparingly. I think it's not an infinitely available resource.
And I always tell my kids, time limit is 10 minutes in a shower. No more than that.
Do you know how my heart breaks every time I have to flush my toilet, knowing exactly that the water that I'm flushing down the toilet is good enough to drink?
And it needn't be, right? Absolutely. It needn't be. So I think, again, as consumers, I mean, I don't like demonizing people, because the grievances that communities have are actually valid.
Yes.
I mean, people have been subject to mistreatment.
Yeah.
And I like what you're saying. So my takeaway,
And also poverty, financial constraints within the working class as well.
these are real things.
Absolutely.
These are real things. But I have a difficulty, you know, and you guys can perhaps tell me if I'm being petty. This idea that you must value this thing, we call it free basic services, when it's actually subsidized.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not good at language.
Yeah.
But I think it would make it difficult for me to see value in this thing when I'm explicitly saying it's free.
You know, the value of water, if you look at water and its significance, its cultural significance, its economic significance, and its social significance.
Especially in the domestic.
Unfortunately, when we talk, and when I talk about water, I'm not just talking about the water that comes out of your tap. I'm talking even just generally
H2O.
your imlambo, the
all of
rivers,
it.
and there's always, in any culture, there's always a cultural significance, and social and an economic significance. We have in our policies, unfortunately, limited it to water for consumption, and we've commodified the asset, and we've removed the other values of water. And maybe that's where the conversation should go, because then you start dealing with the problem at source, where you're not going to see people just throwing their litter in the water because it's got an impact, because they know that they need it for more than one reason. It's not just about drinking, but for a complete human being, this water is of significance.
Absolutely.
And we
also
say
not-
water is life.
And
right?
not even forget the gendered perspective of water. Nobody's really paying attention to the gendered perspective of water.
Sure.
And that's why I always bring up this conversation when I have a chat with political leaders, especially female political leaders, to say that if you are not shouting enough in the policy chambers as women to address the issue of how non-access to water, particularly in socially deprived communities, impacts women, it impacts even children as well.
It's disproportionate.
It's very disproportionate. So if you can understand how to put that gendered differentiation, then you would understand the need for water. It's easier for Lubabalo, who might be a mayor of a certain city, a male figure, to not really understand the impact of it. But as women, as representatives, that should be a gender perspective to it. And a lot of research really doesn't also even go into that a lot, especially in rural communities.
I'm taking notes.
You know, I was recently challenged on that from another lens, the gender and disability aspect. So someone raised the fact that this minimum level of service, which is a standpipe or a water tank within 200 meters, if I'm female and disabled, that 200 meters is too much.
Absolutely.
And we actually don't explicitly accommodate for that anywhere.
Yes.
So I was personally challenged, and it forced me to really step back from my privilege and improve on this issue of listening and hearing different voices as a public servant.
Listen and judge sometimes.
Yeah. So the last question that I have before we wrap up, let's say we're on a doomsday. This municipality A, is absolutely failing to provide water. What legal recourse is it there, for example, like a national department like water and sanitation, in terms of intervening if a municipality's ability to provide water is just totally collapsed, dysfunctional, etc., etc.? Is there any?
So there is recourse, both on the drinking water side, but it's not as strong there. But that's being addressed through the Water Services Amendment Bill. which seeks to give a department a bit more power to intervene in instances where there's drinking water failure.
Yes.
But on the side of sanitation, so Swiss villages, you'd have heard about criminal cases being opened because everyone has the right to a clean environment, etc., etc. That translates into a clause in the National Water Act.
As also in the
Exactly. And so there are those things, but in the current Water Services Act, actually there's Section 63, which is intervention by the department, which empowers the department. In my interpretation, it's jointly with Section 139 to take over the water function up until the time where the services are restored. But in another podcast, you will deal with how well or not well we've dealt with interventions and the consequences those sometimes have. But there is legal recourse through the route of criminal proceedings. But those have not had the results that we'd like to see, but also the department intervening in conjunction with a Section 139 of the Constitution process. So Section 63 of the Water Services Act and 139 and taking over that function up until such a time. But the difficulty with this thing, as with all things in life, you never have capacity for what you don't need. So that the department and water boards don't have people who, at the drop of a hat, can go and take over in a municipality and run things better than anyone could. So the question is, where does that capacity come from? And how do we build it going forward? Because there are instances where support is needed. My argument is the quantity and quality of support that is provided to local government is inadequate. And my basis for that is the continued failure of municipalities. Not to name and shame, but you look at a place like Maluti, Field, Sobota, you change council, you dissolve. So for me,
Tabazinga's joined the crew as well.
clearly something more fundamental is wrong in our model of supporting, which is our Section 154 obligation, right? The fact that we have no case studies we can point to where we intervened or we supported and things were better. That says a lot, and I think for me, in my parting shot, I'd like to see an improvement there. But yes, communities can approach the courts, but as we know, you need resources to do that. But also there can be interventions, but we've seen the consequences of those, where municipalities are sometimes worse off. So we really need to rethink this thing, because we are clearly not doing it right. That I can't run away from.
We can only hope that we don't have more court cases or interventions, because as it is, we already have a lot of
And also having the judiciary being the one to exercise in state right as an independent arm of the state to run what? Another institutional state, which is called local government.
So there's also emerging research there to say there's jurisprudence that's being created that's making it impossible increasingly for municipalities to do what they need to do. Because a decision is made there, or a judgment is issued there, and a court order is issued there. And when you look at them in total, you see, no, man.
Luba, thank you so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed this conversation. It was lovely, and I hope our audience also enjoyed it. But unfortunately, we have to say our goodbyes. Let me say thank you to EPF. EPF is our main sponsor for making this conversation possible. And please subscribe to the link below so that we can have you guys joining us for more episodes to follow. Other than that, peace out.